Hi, everybody, and welcome to the 6th event of the conversation series on animal justice and animal politics. Today's event is entitled Questioning Biodiversity and the Feral, a conversation with Fiona Probyn-Rapsey and Arian Wallach. First, for those of you who don't know me yet, I am Pablo Castello. I'm chair of this series and a research assistant at the Cambridge Centre for Animal Rights Law. Now, before I introduce our speakers, let me give just a very brief overview of what we are going to cover today. So the discussion will be divided in 3 parts. In the first part, I will ask a couple of introductory questions to Fiona and Arian on the meaning of biodiversity and the feral. Then in the second part, we will have an open conversation on whether biodiversity can be problematic, whether we should abandon or not terms such as feral and native, and questions related also to conservation policy. And then at the end, in the third part, we will talk about questions that are more related to field questions, one could call them, the field of animal studies and conservation biology. Where should they move towards? More kind of future-oriented questions about the fields, if you like. So with that out of the way, let me introduce our wonderful speakers for today. Fiona Probyn-Rapsey is professor in the School of Humanities and Social Inquiry at the University of Wollongong, Australia. Fiona's research connects feminist critical race studies and animal studies, examining where, when, and how gender, race, and the species intersect. She's the author of Made to Matter, White Fathers, Stolen Generations, and co-editor of 3 books, Animal Death, Animals in the Anthropocene, Critical Perspectives on Non-Human Futures, and Animalities, Gender, Species, Madness, which Fiona co-edited with Laurie Gruen. Fiona is also Sydney editor with Melissa Boyd and Yvette Watt of the Animal Publics book series through Sydney University Press. She's currently CI on an Australian Research Council project with Professor Lynette Russell, who is the director of the Indigenous Studies at Monash University, and in this project they examine the cultural impacts of introduced animals in Australia. Arian Wallach is a researcher at the Centre for Compassionate Conservation at the University of Technology, Sydney, Australia, and co-founder of the Dingo for Biodiversity Project. Her work combines ecological science with ethics to promote compassionate approaches to conservation. And Arian's research explores how non-native species promote biodiversity and how apex predators enable native-non-native coexistence. She also collaborates with landholders to protect wild animals from killing programs in conservation, farming, and commercial practices. So Fiona and Arian, thank you very much for being today here with us. It's a pleasure and an honor to have you. I'm very much looking forward to this conversation.
Thanks for the invitation, Pablo.
Okay, then let me begin with the first question will be for Arian. So Arian, for those listeners who are unfamiliar with the field of conservation biology, can you explain what is conservation and what is the role of biodiversity in conservation also? Thank you.
That is a big question. What is conservation? And it's a question that I've grappled with for many years. And of course, what you're asking for is just to orient people in the most simple possible way in what generally the field is, what typically people are interested in when they're in that field. But just to start with, I want to just point out that it is a world of ideas, and it is a term that can be a lot richer and more contradictory than it seems. But as its most simple form, conservation is a field of ideas, of thought, of professional activity, of policy that is interested in how humans can live their lives in such a way that enables the rest of the living world to continue to live. So all of the bees and the butterflies and the wolves and the snakes and the grass and everything and the viruses, the whole living world. We want to make sure that with the extraordinary changes, the extraordinary effect that humans have on the world, there's at least a part of society that cares very much to make sure that when we are doing certain things, whatever they are, that we are aware at least and take into consideration, what does this mean for everyone else around us? So if I'm going to build a house right here and there are trees here, what does that mean for these trees? What is it going to mean for the dingoes that live in this area that suddenly there's a human dwelling here? If you have a rat in your roof and you decide to use poison to kill that rat, what does that mean in this case on an ecological sense when the rat gets eaten by an owl? So these are the types of questions that conservationists ask, and they're really about our relationship with the rest of the living world, with the goal of making sure that everyone can continue to flourish into the future.
Thank you very much for that wonderful response, Arian. The second question that I wanted to ask, because as I was saying before, the title for today's conversation is Questioning Biodiversity and the Feral. So the second question, for those who are unfamiliar with the Australian context, Fiona, I want to ask you about this distinction between the feral native distinction, which is very important for conservation, specifically in Australia, but also introduced species versus native species. This is also quite important in conservation biology in the field. So could you tell us, perhaps, Fiona, a little bit about what this distinction means?
Sure, thanks, Pablo. First off, I wanted to acknowledge that I'm on Gundungurra country. That's where I'm living, and I acknowledge the elders of Gundungurra country where I'm based. I also wanted to acknowledge that Rowena Lennox is the co-author of the paper that I'll be referring to today. Rowena Lennox and I both wrote an article called Feral Violence, the Pelorus Experiment. And Rowena herself is also has written quite a lot about dingoes in particular in relation to this topic. But Pablo, this question of what is the feral and what is the native, oh my God, this is a huge one. And you're absolutely right. This idea of the feral kind of haunts and inhabits conservation discourses from a wide array of particular vantage points. And I really liked how Arian said before that conservation is itself a whole kind of arena of worldviews and a different sets of thinking. The feral seems to be an idea of an animal that appears in multiple versions of this idea of conservation as a kind of a runaway idea, something that is the eternal enemy. But is essentially the idea of the feral is a result of our categorical thinking about animals. So in terms of the way in which we think about animals, we divide them into these categories, native being one of them, wildlife being another, livestock being one, pets. And so we have these categories for different kinds of animals, and these categories are largely established through cultural conventions around how we prescribe and describe our relationships to that particular animal. And it doesn't really have anything to do with the species, because we can have a species such as Arian mentioned cats and rats before. We can have cats and rats in all of those categories: native, feral, pet, livestock, agricultural animal, medical animal, et cetera, and feral. So this set of conventions around our cultural understandings in regard to animals legislates in some ways our relationships with them. But it also creates this really obvious problem. If we are addicted to categories in the way in which we are, then we're always going to have ferals, because we're always going to have creatures and subjects who escape these categories. And so the idea of the feral is simply, in our understanding, a reflection of the fact that we have these categories in the first place. So there's nothing essential to the feral in terms of the kind of animal that they could be, other than the fact that ferals disturb our categories that we have for animals. So they blur all these boundaries that we have around animals and our relationships to them. So they're irritants to this kind of cultural habit that we have of prescribing what an animal, where an animal should be and what that animal should be doing. So the idea of the native is another feature of this kind of categorical compulsion that we have regarding our relationships with animals. And like all categories, they're useful. I don't think we can necessarily easily dispense with them if we want to make sense to people, and if we want to make sense as a community of thinkers. We need categorical thinking, and we need categories in order to establish a common language. But we also need to be reflective upon their usage, and we need to understand that conventions around their usage and their meanings change and can be disrupted. When it comes to the idea of the native, for instance, and Arian will be able to speak on this with more legitimacy and authority than I will, but we have situations in Australia, for instance, where introduced animals start to become kind of native. They start to become as if they've been here all the time, which is one of the meanings around the term native. Prior to European colonisation in 1788, all the animals that were here on the continent before that date are considered roughly to be native, and the ones that came after that date are considered introduced. But it's really complicated, isn't it? Because colonisation is, as Patrick Wolf says, it's not an event that happens; it's a structure. Colonisation continues, and it doesn't necessarily even have a firm starting date. And we have different periods of introductions of different kinds of animals, and some animals escape really early on in the colonisation of Australia, and some animals then escape and they keep going and they keep going and they change and they morph in the landscape to acclimatise, and they don't necessarily then resemble the kinds of animals that they could be compared to from the home country or the mother country. So the classic example is rabbits. So Australia has been very successfully colonised by rabbits, and there are some conservation biologists who will think about rabbits that we have in Australia as Australian rabbits, because they're kind of a bit different to the European or the Spanish rabbit that was first introduced to Australia. So the native, I tend to always bring things back to dingoes, so you'll have to stop me when I talk too much about dingoes. But they're also a really interesting example of what does this term native mean? They came between 3,000 and 6,000 years ago. They came prior to European colonisation of the continent. They also, for some people, are going to be permanently an introduced animal that whose belonging is essentially questionable. But for others, they are absolutely the native dog. So the term native is like the term feral. It really reflects a particularly Eurocentric compulsion towards categorical thinking. And in what I like to think of in relation to that is, well, what do the animals think their names are? How do the animals see themselves? Do they run around identifying themselves as feral? Yes, over here. Native? Yes, over here. And if you think about that, then you can kind of understand how absurd it might be to think that these are always forever accurate accounts of the animals themselves.
Thank you very much for that wonderful response, Fiona. Yes, I really like what you said at the end, that you like to think of what the animals would say. It's the question of animal language and animals speaking and what they think about us as well interests me immensely. What I wanted to say before we move on to the next kind of part of the conversation is that, as Fiona was mentioning, I really wanted to recommend this article, Feral Violence, the Pelorus Experiment, which was published in Environment and Planning. It's a really amazing piece. So for people interested in the feral, it's very, very good. And also Arian published an article called Recognizing Animal Personhood in Compassionate Conservation in the journal Conservation Biology, where a lot of the things that we are going to discuss today, if you are more interested in these topics, you can go to those 2 articles. I think they are fantastic. Okay, so then one of the things that I believe, and I've done a bit of work on this, but both of you know much more about this than myself, is that conservation assumes that biodiversity is intrinsically good. It's one of Michael Selle's postulates in 1985. It's a kind of crucial prerogative. And also that biodiversity ought to be protected in some cases at all costs, as it were, at least in relation to feral or invasive animals. If we need to kill many of them and sort of eradicate entire populations of animals, communities of animals of a given species, then in conservation biology, this is done. And both of you, I believe, have said that this kind of logic, this way of thinking, is dangerous in some respects. So I just wanted you to perhaps discuss this topic. Could you perhaps discuss a little bit about this, say why you think this is a problem? Yeah.
I think it's important that maybe I just start with the question that you asked me originally, which I didn't answer part of it, which is what is biodiversity? And it's important to bear in mind when we ask a question like, is biodiversity good and sacred? Or, am I willing to die for biodiversity? Well, what is biodiversity? And the problem with the word biodiversity is that it means anything you want it to mean, anything at all. Usually when people think about a term about like biodiversity, they're not thinking about the roosters that are crowing in the background. They're usually not thinking about ourselves. Am I part of biodiversity? Is that rooster part of biodiversity? What about all of the microbiome, like all of the bugs and, who knows, maybe I even have worms. I haven't dewormed myself. My dog's worms, like that live on our skin, that live in our digestive system, that live in our eyes, that in our hair. Those are all kinds of life forms. Usually when we think about biodiversity, we're thinking elephants, tigers, and really bright little birds, right? Like we have certain ideas on what we mean by biodiversity. We tend to care more about certain creatures than others. And like Fiona was saying, we tend to categorize life in particular ways. And then people like myself, I'm a conservation biologist, a feral conservation biologist, but nonetheless, I practice the tools of the trade of a conservation biologist. What we do is we'll look out in the world and we turn all of this life into data. Like there's one species of tree and that's another species of tree. And those are 2 different categories. And so if you look in your screen, you can see 1, 2, 3, 4 categories, excluding me and excluding Firefly down here, my dog. And some ants that walked here. So we count those things. And then I think what's important for us to to establish is that those numbers that someone like me will go out and count is then what you will hear on your morning news and say, biodiversity is declining. And what does that even mean? How can something that means anything you want, how can that go up or down? So in order to say biodiversity is declining or increasing or doing anything, first we have to agree that this tree over there and that tree over there, you probably just see a blurry green, but you can imagine with me, that these are 2 different categories. And if I was to, well, why me? If one of these trees was to sadly die, then we went from 2 to 1. There's been right? And then that is what you will hear on the news when you hear there's been an extinction event, or there's been a decline in species richness or a decline in biodiversity. But bear in mind, when you hear that rooster, you are hearing the voice of a child of a dinosaur. But we also agree that dinosaurs are extinct. And that's, again, part of this idea of categories. And the categories are not created just out of the blue by a bunch of, scientists that have no feelings, that have no humanity, that have no culture. The way that we create our categories is based on who we are. And if you had different people that had different values and different cultures and different senses, they would split up the world differently. They might look at these two trees and consider them to be one thing, or they would consider the chickens out there and the dinosaurs to be one thing, one category. Or maybe they would consider me and my dogs to be one category. Mammals, for example, is a category, right? So, and the same goes, right? That's the politics essentially that goes into taxonomy. Let me give you maybe an idea quickly that will make it maybe clearer for you. One of the most famous animals probably, and I think most of the people listening will know, is the polar bear. The polar bear is the poster child for anyone who is active in concerns around climate change. Now, the polar bear has a sister species called the brown bear. They can interbreed. Polar bears and brown bears or grizzly bears can interbreed. So according to, if you were to ask, as Fiona said, if you were to ask a polar bear and ask a brown bear, are you guys of two different categories? Some of them would probably say yes, maybe they're racist, right? Like, I don't like the whites, I don't like the browns. But some of them will be like, no, we're both big bears, right? And they will create offspring, which people have called Pisleys, for example. There is no hard and fast rule in which a polar bear is a category and the brown bear is a category, but do you understand the politics of what would happen if conservationists as a whole were to merge the polar bear with the brown bear? The brown bear is not endangered. In fact, by joining those two categories together, you've suddenly got a bigger population. And then if the polar bear, let's say, was to go extinct, as is feared in relation to climate change, there would be no extinction because they're just the white morph of the brown bear. So that is the kind of stuff that makes up all of the conversation around biodiversity. And it's not that any one of those is right and any one of them is wrong. They're all right and they're all wrong because they are all stories. And that is what scientists are. And it's the biggest myth of generally of all nonfiction, is that there's no fiction in nonfiction. We are storytellers of a particular genre. We tell our stories in the way that we can tell a story. And the best kind of learning that we can do around learning about the world, the living world, and all of its complexities that doesn't care a hoot about our categories, but we need them because otherwise we can't have a conversation. Those categories is what allows us to weave the stories about the world and figure out what we want to do. But also we need to learn to be more open to the uncertainty that these categories are not real, that something can be true and not true at the same time, that science is not infallible, that scientists are human beings, and that we can learn a lot more by having different kinds of perspectives coming together that both will say, there's two species of bear here, there's one species of bear here, and that's both true.
Fiona, do you have any thoughts?
I've forgotten what the question is. Are we talking just about biodiversity and the usefulness of the term?
No, so the question was about this crucial assumption in conservation, that is that biodiversity is intrinsically good.
Oh,
but
right.
Also this is also related to feral invasive species because it plays a crucial role in how biodiversity is understood, who should be protected, what is the meaning of biodiversity, all sorts of things. That's more or less the question.
Okay, thanks. I think Arian makes a really important point there about biodiversity meaning multiple things and not necessarily always the correct thing even within the same context, and also flagging the importance of cultural differences regarding those particular categories and taxonomies that we construct around animal life. I think that probably one of the common understandings of biodiversity that I can think of in the Australian context that I think might be actually still quite useful is to think about the ways in which biodiversity is often used as a warning against monocultures. And we see monocultures, for instance, predominantly within animal agriculture and livestock industries, particularly of the intensive variety. And biodiversity, it sometimes functions as this necessary warning against the overly mechanized and instrumentalized relationship that we have to some animal species that massifies them, and that creates millions and millions and millions of the same kind of animal. You know, think about industrial animal complexes, for instance. So biodiversity can be seen as a useful reminder that kind of relationship that we have with animals discounts the idea that beyond that control and that domination of animals that we see within animal agriculture, there is this incredible sense of multiplicity and bounty and things that are yet to be discovered. As Arian pointed out, you know, things get turned into data, but that's still happening. And there is this idea within biodiversity that we don't have all that data yet. And I tend to look at that as quite a positive thing, that we haven't quite yet got ourselves into a position where we can say we know everything about animal life and ecological life. That can be quite a positive reminder of the necessity of humility before animal life. So yeah, a kind of reminder to watch our step and watch our own overreach when it comes to thinking about how we impact on animal and ecological life. But yeah, you're right in that biodiversity is also used as an excuse for untold violence against particular kinds of animals that become the held up as the principal threat to biodiversity. So when we think about the Pelorus experiment, for instance, and the planned eradication of goats by using dingoes, that's just one tiny example of what happens right across conservation biology. And again, Arian is best placed to speak about this because she is a conservation biologist. I'm not. I work on the kind of the cultural narrative side of things. But what we're seeing in the studies that Rowena and I have done in relation to, for instance, the Pelorus experiment and the way in which biodiversity and the term conservation gets used, is that it is positioned as a simple good that doesn't need explanation, and in that way, it doesn't also get to own up to its own violence and the violence that is needed to maintain this particular perspective of a kind of biodiversity that is good. And in some of the experiment that we observed, of course, the good biodiversity was the biodiversity that was seen as native, and the bad biodiversity, i.e. that represented by the goats, was seen as a bad form. And so in order to pursue this pure image of what constitutes a proper biodiverse island, people had to die, and hundreds of goats were killed. Dingoes were instrumentalized as bioweapons, and that kind of violent apparatus that is needed to maintain these landscapes as legitimately biodiverse rather than just chaotic and biodiverse is often subsumed. Is often hidden in these projects, and that's one thing that Rowena and I were really interested in drawing out. If that's the object, this kind of pristine landscape, this pristine, good biodiverse landscape, then let's also talk about the violence that it takes to create that, and let's see what that does to the social license that biodiversity and conservation assumes it has when it enters into these projects. Because as we saw in that particular experiment, the Pelorus experiment, when it became publicly known that was how the experiment was going to be conducted, putting dingoes onto an island with implants with 1080 in them that would go off and kill them after they had killed between 300 and 600 goats. When that became publicly known, it was not endorsed publicly. So there was a reaction to it. It created a situation where conservation biology was at risk of losing its social license to operate in that particular way. So, yeah, for me, it's about the violence that attends this question of creating and maintaining biodiverse landscapes.
One thing that I wanted also to touch on at this time, well, both of you have argued that this notion of the feral and invasive and native, this dichotomy, it follows sort of racial logics. It operates in a very similar way to how racism operates as well. So, but I believe this might have not been kind of clear yet in your responses. So I was wondering whether you could both say something a little bit about that part.
My sense of the ways in which race and species intersect is very much influenced by the work of Claire Kim, whose work, Dangerous Crossings, is a really good account of the ways in which race and species interconnect as taxonomies. And as categorical thinking, race is a category that maintains certain illusions about social organizations that resemble the way in which we imagine animals also organize as species. And consequently, they both have the same kinds of problems around hybridity and around feral and around category breaches. So, but racism itself is something that is also heavily dependent on the idea of the animal. And so there are many scholars in animal studies doing fascinating work tracing the importance of this idea of the animal to the ways in which racism operates as a kind of anthropocentrism, as a way of creating a species and race hierarchy that is fundamentally interconnected. So this is probably one of the more interesting parts of animal studies work for me, because this is how I became interested in animal studies, essentially, is through looking at racism and colonization in Australia, and the interconnectedness of species language and racism in colonization itself. And it's something that I have to say is incredibly disturbing when you first encounter it. It's hard to know what to make of the language of dehumanization that occurs around racism, and it's difficult and it's tricky to think about the ways in which it also invites us to think about the ways in which animals also aren't animals in the way that dehumanization requires it. So thinking about the projects of anti-racism and pro-animal advocacy simultaneously is, I think, one of the most fascinating parts of animal studies work that's going on at the moment. It's by no means settled, the questions that this raises. And one thing that I'm really concerned about is the ways in which animal advocacy sometimes flattens the differences that we see between groups who suffer from racist vilification and the ways in which animals are animalized. And when you see kind of animal advocacy organizations talking about total liberation, for instance, the effect of that total liberation, meaning we must liberate women, we must liberate animals, we must liberate Indigenous people, we must liberate Black people, we must liberate everyone all at once. There's got to be total liberation. Some of the problems with that are probably quite obvious to a lot of people listening to this, which is that it really flattens the debate. It really flattens the differences between those particular projects. And without very careful elaboration and careful thinking, it makes it look like animal issues are the same as issues that affect non-white people within majoritarian white settler colonial countries. And the effect of that, of course, is to basically put an end to any potential dialogue on those matters because of the degree of offence that can potentially cause, because animalisation is a key weapon for racism. And so we end up using the same flattening device that that racism has also used. So for me, we really have to think about the way in which taxonomies of race and species operate, but we really also have to think about the ways in which racism is context specific. It has to involve the people who are also affected by that racism in a meaningful way, and think about the ways in which there are limits to analogies, and there are limits to thinking about interconnections that need to be respected, while also explored and thought through in a way that can work for the benefit of all sorts of political projects simultaneously without trumping one above the other. So, yeah.
I just wanted to add to what you just said, Fiona, because I agree with pretty much everything you said. We also had the opportunity to have Gledgin Kim on our conversation series, on a conversation on race, conservation, and human dominion over animals. And one of the things that Gledgin Kim argues, and I really like, is that we should not think necessarily of race and the species as in terms of doing an analogy. Benedicte Boisseron as well in Afrodoc discusses this matter, but rather understanding how these oppressions are interconstituted. Because if what one understands is that, and this is what anthropocentrism really is about, what the target of oppression has always been this paradigmatic understanding of the human person as a white, able-bodied, rational man who is independent and so on. And when one understands that's the target, one is not saying all these kinds of oppression are analogous to each other. One is saying there is this epistemology that is kind of feeding and enabling that oppression. And then the questions that we ask are very different than when one is saying, oh, racism is like speciesism or like sexism or like whatever thing. It's a very different way of thinking, I believe. And Benedicte Boisseron Afrodoc is fantastic in this respect, and Claire Jenkins' work as well. So yes, I really appreciate everything that you said. Thank you very much, Fiona. The last thing I wanted to add on this perhaps is that people might wish to kind of consider that the term, and this relates to a lot of the things that Arian was saying, the term invasive and the term feral are not some kind of scientific categories that are neutral, as it were. When we say, for example, someone is invading us, that has militaristic connotations, and is usually tied with racist discourse. I always remember this in my hometown, that people think of immigrants and they say, oh, they are invading us as well. And we already said that they, us as well, dichotomy. So there is nothing neutral or scientific or apolitical about this discourse, which is something that perhaps sometimes is missed. So yes, I just wanted to add this couple of remarks. But let's move now to the next question, because we have quite a bit to cover still. So, of course, one of the first things that some people in the field of conservation might think, and this is perhaps a challenge that has been put to compassionate conservation, that Arian is it's a leading scholar in the field, is that some conservationists might argue, well, what happens if so-called feral animals or invasive species, they kill many other species and that might be in danger of going extinct? What happens when, certain animals might completely lead some species into extinction? So what some of conservationists might argue is, well, in those occasions, we just need to kill those animals, because otherwise, this will be a disaster or something like that. But I believe that you would disagree with this position. And my question then would be, how would you respond to this potential challenge?
Yeah, thank you for the question. It's a complex one for sure, because it mixes, it appears to be simple, but it is much more complex than it seems. To start with, I would say, certainly in conservation, and it could be that this is just generally a political way of thinking, we tend to think in lifeboat scenarios a lot more than there are lifeboat scenarios in the world, right? We tend to create these scenarios where, well, either this person gets kicked off the boat or that person gets kicked off the boat. They won't both survive. Now, that's essentially the question, right? Let's say I've got a rat. It's usually a rat because I don't know why people don't seem to like rats. I've had rats as pets. They're the best. But there's a rat on an island and they're eating a bird that exists nowhere else. If we don't kill the rat, goes the bird, right? That's a lifeboat scenario. Now, the thing is, I've never been on a lifeboat. I've never been in a lifeboat scenario, not once. I've never met anyone who's been on a lifeboat scenario once. I've never met one who's been on a lifeboat scenario ever once. I assume there are lifeboat scenarios. And certainly I would say that one thing that we all experience all the time is that there's always a tension between choices, right? There's never perfect answers. It's what my colleague Chelsea Batavia has worked on a lot, is this idea of moral residue, where no matter what you do, there's going to be some kind of cost. Everyone experiences that when they go to the supermarket and they're socially aware and they go, do I buy that thing that's been, grown locally, but is full of pesticides? Do I get that organic thing and it's full of plastic? Or do I get that, meat product or that plant product that has killed lots of animals when it was, that's what that experience is of moral residue. But what you're asking specifically is more of this kind of lifeboat scenario. So number one, I want to say lifeboat scenarios are rare. I've never encountered one, and nor have I encountered one as an ecologist and as a conservation biologist. And that's an important statement, because I have worked in the field of invasion biology where those kinds of statements are made regularly. It's either this species or that species. And again, reminding again this context that we're talking about categories that are not immutable. I have not yet been convinced that any scenario that has been put in front of me and I've spent enough time looking at was indeed a lifeboat scenario. So the first thing I would say is that when we're talking about a topic like species and their interactions, we're talking ecology. And if there's one thing that ecology is not, it's not binary, it's not simple, it's not an either or sort of a world. It is infinitely complex, and it is possibly more complex than we are currently capable of thinking. So when we look at an ecosystem and say, oh, well, if I only just got rid of those goats on Pelorus Island, the world would be a better place, and Michael Jackson would come back and sing for us that the world has been healed. Heal the world, make it a better place, by eradicating goats. Yeah, that is, it simplifies the complexity of ecology to the absurd. Is it true that as a scientist, for example, if I had an invasion biology ideology, and let's say all the goats had been killed on Pelorus Island, there's not a single goat, I could go to Pelorus Island and while the goats were there and look for what is the goat's favorite food and say, well, there's a certain percentage of that there. And then after the goats are gone, I'll find a higher percentage and I'll say, well, there has been an ecological recovery. Based on what? There's less of something, now there's more of something. That is life. There is no living creature. And those of us, by the way, that are very sensitive to questions of animal cruelty, that are vegan, for example, something that we have to grapple with. There is no such thing as a living organism that doesn't harm someone. That's not an option. We don't get to live and not cause death and suffering. It's the curse. It's the curse of the living world. And it's not like native species are just going around in some weird utopia that is outside, in which there's no predation and there's no disease and there's no pain and there's no suffering. If a native species is eaten by a non-native cat or eaten by a native hawk, that animal doesn't care whether it's like, oh no, I'm being eaten by a non-native predator. If you're eaten, you're eaten. Are there scenarios in which one species on its own can drive the extinction of another, no matter what the situation is? That I don't know. It's plausible that there are situations like that, but usually if population is going extinct, there's a combination of ecological factors at play, and if that is a process that we want to intervene in, and it's not obvious that we do want to intervene in something, even an extinction, but if we do want to intervene in that, there can be a lot of different ways that we can intervene in that scenario. And I'll just end with an example of such a thing, because not my favorite, but still, a movie was made about this, where there was a small colony of penguins that was slowly declining, and foxes were predating on these penguins that's off the coast of Australia, these little penguins. People really cared about these penguins. They wanted to have this nesting colony of penguins on this particular island. And so they were poisoning foxes and shooting them and poisoning and shooting them and poisoning. And as the time goes by, no matter how many dead foxes they accumulated, pile of dead foxes getting higher and higher, the colony of penguins just keeps shrinking. And that's, by the way, the typical thing. Conservationists go out, guns blasting, poisons getting thrown out like confetti, and you get nothing good out of it other than just death and destruction and despair. And that was one of these typical cases, until this local farmer said, hey, I'm not having problems with foxes, and I'm raising I've got free-ranging chickens. And what's the difference between a chicken and a penguin? A penguin is just a chicken with a dinner suit. Let's just teach these guardian dogs that I've been using for years and years to protect my free-ranging chickens for this colony of penguins. And that became a successful project that was then implemented in other places, turned into a rather corny movie. And there are ways, I think, as a rule of thumb, if we want to be simplistic, the moment you take out a gun, you've lost something. And sometimes there might be a moment to take out a gun, but you would hope that we have the creative capacity and the innovation to think in a more holistic and a more open way about different ways that we can solve problems. I don't know many problems that have been solved very well at the end of a gun.
Yeah, I would just want to very quickly add to what Arian has said there. What Arian really draws attention to, both in what she's just said, but also in her other work, is that there is this profound need for more complex narratives around every single conservation effort and project, and bringing in those multiple viewpoints about what the problem actually looks like in the first place. Is there an agreed sense of what the parameters of the problem are? And bringing in cultural and social meanings and terrains into that understanding of the problem from the very outset seems to me to be crucial to that as well. And then not reaching for eradication programs, because as Arian said, they don't work. You might have a project that claims to successfully remove the last rat or the last goat from a certain section, and then 2 weeks later they're back. So they don't even seem to work, even on their own terms. So other things have to be brought into the equation. I wholeheartedly agree with Arian that killing is absolutely, it seems to be the first thing that is thought of and is funded in the Australian context at the moment, but really should be the last resort. And you can see in really, really complex debates, for instance, that around the Brumbies and the Snowy Mountains at the moment, where a controversy gains so much traction within the public sphere, you can see the multiplicity of voices coming in, and you can see that that debate has been taken away from primarily conservation biology as a discourse and moved into a parliamentary space and moved into a local ground, the local grounds of action and little local groups that are pro-Brumby, anti-Brumby, and a little bit in between. And you can start to see the complex negotiations happening. So you can see some groups saying, well, let's just create a few paddocks just for the Brumbies, and others saying, no, they all have to go because they're all killing the sphagnum moss, et cetera, and we don't want to have horses at all anywhere in this national park. So I guess what I'm saying is that if you ask the people who are directly involved in some of these conservation activities, you do get more complex answers and more complex terrains of the debate. Where the media comes in and often reframes that as a simple binary of conservationists versus everybody else or versus animals, then you get this simplification of the debate in which no one wins. So yeah, I don't have the answers to this in terms of what should be done, because I do think it really is context specific. But I have a little bit of hope that when we do make it possible for the public to get involved and to start participating, reading the science and thinking about the impacts on animals, that there is kind of hope there that nobody wants to pick up a gun. But maybe I'm a bit naive there.
Or I hope that you are not being naive at all on this. But the last question for this kind of blog, for this second part that I wanted to ask both of you, and you already touched on this slightly, Fiona, at some point, is that, so if we consider that these notions of invasive and feral and so on, they are very problematic and they are not apolitical at all and so on, whether we should try to just get rid of those categories altogether and begin to think about how we categorize species and animals differently, or whether we should keep those notions. Perhaps the notion of introduced species might be of some help or not. What do you think about this? How do you think that we should, what we should do, whether we should get rid of them? And if we should get rid of them, what is the alternative as well? What should we label different animals? How should we deal with all these things?
Yeah, that's a really, really interesting question. It's a really, really big question as well. I think one thing that we can't do is legislate the meaning of these terms from the outset, but we can observe how they shift and change over time depending on who's using them. The word feral, for instance, is a really good example of this. Arian used the word feral to describe herself as a conservation biologist. And so you see where the word feral is used to describe something positive, breaking out of certain structures and ways of thinking, going rogue, going wild. So all these words have the potential to be reused and put into circulation and have a different effect. And so my hope would be that we could do that with these kinds of terms. And in some ways, feral has is a particularly gifted term in this regard, because it does have so many different meanings depending on who's using it. I think in terms of the work that we can do in animal studies, I use the term introduced species, for instance, introduced animals, to describe a project that I'm looking at with Lynette Russell at the moment, because we're focusing on the animals that were introduced as part of the first fleet in 1788. So that's horses and cattle and sheep primarily, and cats. So we're using the term introduced there because it makes sense to people who have an immediate understanding of what that means. It doesn't mean that we therefore subscribe to the view that as introduced animals they have a particular value and meaning and that's a permanent state of being. So yeah, look, I don't think we can just drop terms because they have this problematic history, because animal studies is also at a key point in its phase as a field where it can resonate with people who are working in different disciplines, and it can work. It can resonate with animal advocacy, and it can resonate with the public. But we have to go through this process of always contextualizing and explaining the terms that we're using critically to describe the kinds of animals that we are also talking about, without flattening the differences between those animals as well. I mean, even the word animal, I mean, wouldn't we want to just chuck that out? It's so horrendous as a word, as Derrida points out. But we have to strategically and tactically engage in that space while doing things like re-embracing terms that can be queered, like the word feral.
Yeah, thanks for that question. No one's asked me that before, and it's nice to be challenged with a new question. I can say that in a publication that in the study that we published a couple of years ago, we did use different language with the aim. Okay, I'm going to admit it now on camera. It was partly to irritate my colleagues. I admit that we use this language a little bit, not to irritate them just for the point of irritating, for irritation's sake, but to draw some attentions to parallels and to make this way of thinking less comfortable. And the language that we used was the language of migrant. We used the word immigrant and emigrant to talk about populations that had been moved in the past from point A to B and from the rest of the world back to point A. And we avoided the terminology of native or introduced unless we needed it for particular, for practical points. And the reason partly why that I would say that that's knowingly an irritant is because typically the quiet girls, the people that typically people that would care about native species will have strong inclusive views on on allowing the liberty of humans to move from place to place around the world, particularly when there's a need. And one of the things that we were pointing out is that a significant number of populations or even species that are defined as invasive, not native, introduced, are either endangered or even extinct in the part of the world where they are considered native. And so we therefore gently pointed to, we could define them again, and I'm pointing also to what Fiona was saying before about how difficult it is to draw these kinds of parallels, just like between taxonomy and racism. So here we're drawing parallels between species movements, population movements, and human categories of, national belonging. So would we consider, for example, the rabbit in Australia a refugee? Because they are listed as vulnerable in the IUCN Red List of Threatened Species, or even more so, the wild camel that has been extinct in the wild, the dromedary camel, for 3,000 to 5,000 years. Where I'm originally from in Israel, the only camels I've ever seen are part of the slave labor, which is a particular category, again, which may be unfair, or at least they're intertwined in a positive relationship of one kind or another. There are no wild camels anyway in anywhere else but in Australia, which is amazing that they're back. I think the listeners should know that there's a species that has been extinct in the wild for thousands of years. There are now possibly hundreds of thousands of them in the wild, and no conservationist gets the gold star for that one. No one gets the credit for that. That's got nothing to do with us. They did that not only by themselves, in a sense. Yes, they were brought here to Australia against their wills, but they are the ones that took off, survived, and just restarted their own cultures, their own ways, their own, who knows what, if they live the same ways as those that went extinct, possibly due to human hunting and just generally constantly taking them from the wild into captivity. There are so many stories like that, and those don't get into the data. There's no, if you go into the IUCN Red List of Threatened Species, type in the word dromedary camel, you'll get an error. It's not a species. It doesn't exist. But I've seen them. They were right in front of me. I swear to God, they exist, but they're not in the data. And when that scales up, it completely changes our understanding of the world. So yeah, back to your original question about language. I'd say that there are words that just need to be taken out of use. Invasive species is a slur. It's designed as a slur. It's nothing but a curse word. It's like those crappy ones that we don't like. So if you have a word that is literally a slur and can't be brought, because it literally in its meaning, I don't know how you can bring back a word like invasive. Feral is awesome. We should certainly, may the whole world be feral. Livestock, that's a pretty, that can maybe, let that one go. Animal, yeah, that can, it depends how it's used, right? If we accept ourselves as animals, what would that do? And by the way, I don't know many, if any, really conservationists or that truly do we think of ourselves as animals? I mean, am I and Firefly and the rooster over there and the butterfly and down there, and are we really one thing? And if that's the case, why are we so hard on ourselves? If we're animals, right? We always talk about, we need to shrink the human footprint, right? If we're good environmentalists, we're shrinking our footprint. I've studied wolves and dingoes. I've never wanted to shrink their paw print. I want their paw print on everything. I want howls and growls and paw prints everywhere. I love what they do. Why don't we love what we do? Why do we want to shrink our own footprint? What is it about us that is so not animal that makes us the invasive species, us the aliens, us somehow in some truly categorical way not belong in this world, and everything that we do is somehow bad, is somehow a harm? I don't know. I think there's a lot of creatures around here that think that I'm pretty cool. Maybe not in a personal way, but they're quite happy to have me here. The ants that are walking down here and the parrots that come and eat from here, and and the snakes that sometimes eat these chickens, they seem to think they're quite happy to have some humans around.
Many thanks, Arian. And now I will ask the last question because we are a little bit in a hurry. It has gone over a little bit than we initially thought. So the last question I just want to ask to both of you, perhaps Fiona, you can answer this question first. It's what are you going to do next in terms of what you're working on in your research, which is super exciting, everything you've done so far, but what comes next?
Yeah, so started on a brand new project with Lynette Russell, who's Director of Indigenous Studies at Monash University, and we're going to be looking at cultural conflicts over introduced animals, but really specific case studies that unfortunately have been completely interrupted by COVID. So we're about a year behind in that project, but that's exciting because we're looking at the ways in which when new animals are introduced through settler colonialism, there's quite a massive impact on the ecology, but also on the epistemic knowledge held by Indigenous people about the land and animals and the whole concept of country, animals, plants, everything is in that. And so the interruption to that working knowledge of country is something that occurs with settler colonization. And so we're looking at how worldviews collide and often become focused on introduced animals in really interesting ways that don't necessarily align with the native versus introduced kind of dichotomy that we might suspect from the outset. And so that's quite an interesting project. So for me, animal studies really engaging with the settler colonial context in which it operates in Australia is something that I'm really focused on for the next few years or so. Yeah. Thank you, Pablo.
Thank you very much, Fiona.
One of the things that I'm going to be working on over the next few years is the vision is to create what I hope to call the biodiversities plural, biodiversities prism, which will be an interactive map where you can slot in a particular ideology or cultural preference, and then get to see a map of the world in terms of things like biodiversity hotspots, species richness, and trends. So, for example, if you want to ascribe or just see what the world looks like from the eyes of someone who believes in the ideology of invasion biology, it will take out all of the rabbits of Australia and the camels, for example, and will leave those defined as native. If you want to ascribe to the ideology that all species that are there should be included, then the rabbits and the camels are back in there. If you want to, if you tend to be of the view that taxonomy should, that species should be split into small units, right? The polar bear and the brown bear, two different things. You'll see what that does to biodiversity. If you want to lump them, you'll see what that does to biodiversity. So it will be this interactive map with the goal of really showing how data that seems simple, like, the number 3, the number 32, the number 137, are tied to our cultural leanings, our ideologies, our values, even our just personal preferences.
Thank you very much, Arian and Fiona, for everything. Both of your works, I'm very interested in it, and settler colonialism, animal studies, that intersection to me is also very important. And what you were saying now, Arian, sounds super interesting also. I always end all our conversations with one quote. So let me just very, very quickly read this quote that I prepared for today, because I thought it was quite suitable for our conversation. And it's by Judith Butler in the book, The Force of Nonviolence and Ethico-Political Bind. And in it, Butler says that power is already operating through schemas of racism that persistently distinguish not only between lives that are more and less valuable, more and less livable, but also between lives that register more or less emphatically as lives. A life can register as a life only within an epistemological schema that presents it as such. The epistemological nullification or foreclosure of the living character of a population, which is the very definition of a genocidal epistemology, structures the field of the living along a continuum that has concrete implications for the question, whose are the lives that are worth preserving, whose lives matter, whose lives are grievable. So I thought that this quote was very suitable for our conversation today, because what Butler is suggesting is that when a knowledge system is structured by racial categories that do not render the lives of other beings as lives, as it happens in conservation with racial categories like invasive and feral, then killing non-human animals does not appear as a crime, because they are not seen as lives worthy of moral considerability and respect, which is, I thought, more or less what we have been covering today and what Arian and Fiona has been explaining all this time fantastically and wonderfully. So anyways, I think I will just leave it here because we need to go. Fiona and Arian, thank you very, very much again for being here today. I really enjoyed the conversation, and I'm sure that our listeners will enjoy it too. Thank you.
Thanks, Pablo. Bye, Arian. Bye, Pablo.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye. Take care.